I've spent years convincing myself that some things are better left buried. But lately, I've been reading posts here where people confess things they've carried for decades, and it got me thinking about the one crime that still follows me around no matter how much time passes. This happened when I was 32. The newspapers called it the missing safe. Investigators spent months trying to understand how a vault-sized safe could simply disappear without a trace. Friends, coworkers, and even some of the detectives came up with theories. None of them were close. The truth is simple. I took it. Not just the money inside. The entire safe. At the time, I worked as a maintenance contractor for a small financial services company. The business wasn't a bank, but it handled large amounts of cash, valuable documents, and precious metals for wealthy clients. Hidden beneath their office building was a reinforced storage room containing a massive steel safe that everyone treated like a fortress. Most employees barely knew it existed. I knew every detail. The company trusted me because I fixed things. Broken locks, faulty wiring, damaged security cameras, those were my responsibilities. People tend to ignore the guy carrying a toolbox. They stop seeing him after a while. That's how I learned things I probably shouldn't have known. I learned which alarms malfunctioned during power fluctuations. I learned which executives cut corners. I learned who left keys where they weren't supposed to. And eventually, I learned exactly how much was sitting inside that safe. The motive wasn't greed at first. At least that's what I told myself. My life was falling apart. I was drowning in debt after a failed business venture. Creditors called daily. My marriage was hanging by a thread. Every month felt like a battle I was losing. Then one afternoon, while performing routine maintenance in the storage area, I overheard two executives discussing a large transfer scheduled for the following month. The amount they mentioned made my stomach turn. It was more money than I had ever imagined seeing in one place. For weeks afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I wasn't planning a crime then. I was just imagining possibilities. At least that's what I told myself. Looking back now, I think the crime started the moment I allowed myself to believe I deserved that money more than the people who owned it. That was the first lie. And it wouldn't be the last. After that conversation, the safe became impossible to ignore. Every time I entered the building, I found myself looking toward the lower level where it sat behind concrete walls and layers of security. I told myself I was only curious. In reality, I was becoming obsessed. The strange thing about crossing a line is that it rarely feels dramatic at first. It happens in tiny steps. A question becomes an idea. An idea becomes a fantasy. A fantasy becomes a plan. I started paying closer attention to routines. Not because anyone asked me to, but because I wanted to know how predictable people really were. Most of them were. Employees arrived at the same times, took the same breaks, complained about the same problems. What surprised me most was how much trust existed inside the company. Trust creates blind spots. People assumed that because I worked there, I belonged everywhere. That realization scared me. It also excited me. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about whether the crime was possible. I was thinking about whether I had the nerve to go through with it. The next few weeks were less about planning a theft and more about testing myself. I kept waiting for the idea to fade. I hoped common sense would return and remind me how ridiculous the whole thing was. Instead, the thought settled deeper into my mind. It followed me to work, sat with me during dinner, and kept me awake long after midnight. I started making excuses for myself. The company was wealthy. The executives were careless. Nobody would truly suffer. Those arguments sound pathetic now, but at the time they felt convincing. I wasn't preparing for a crime in my own head, I was preparing a defense. What worried me most wasn't getting caught. It was becoming the kind of person who could do something like this. I remember standing alone in the storage area one evening after finishing a maintenance job. The building was quiet. Everything looked normal. Yet I felt different. There was a moment when I realized I had stopped asking, "Should I do this?" Instead, I had started asking, when? That change frightened me more than anything else. Once I crossed that mental line, I convinced myself that information was harmless. I wasn't stealing anything yet. I wasn't breaking into rooms or disabling alarms. I was just paying attention. That was the excuse, anyway. Because of my maintenance role, I had legitimate reasons to access areas most employees never saw. Over time, I began keeping mental notes. Which doors were used the least? Which cameras occasionally lost signal for a few seconds? Which managers stayed late and which rushed home the moment the workday ended? What shocked me was how ordinary everything looked behind the scenes. People imagine security as an impenetrable system, but in reality it's often a collection of habits. And habits create weaknesses. I also learned more about the safe itself. It was enormous, far larger than anything a single person could move. The idea of taking it still sounded absurd. But instead of discouraging me, that fact became a puzzle. I found myself studying loading docks, freight access points, and delivery schedules. Every answer created 2 new questions. And with every question I solved, the impossible began to feel slightly less impossible. There's a stage in every bad decision where you still have time to walk away. I reached that stage more than once. A normal person would have taken the warning signs seriously. My debts were growing, my stress was getting worse, and every new step I took made the situation riskier. Instead of backing off, I treated those pressures like reasons to continue. The plan existed mostly in my head. I avoided writing things down because even seeing it on paper felt dangerous. But mentally, I kept refining it, imagining different scenarios and wondering what could go wrong. The problem was that reality refused to cooperate with fantasy. Unexpected visitors showed up at the office. Schedules changed. Managers made decisions that disrupted routines I had been counting on. Each change forced me to rethink everything. Oddly, that made me more determined. The more effort I invested, the harder it became to admit the entire idea was a mistake. I wasn't chasing money anymore. I was chasing proof that I could pull off something everyone would consider impossible. That obsession became far more dangerous than greed. Around that time, people started noticing that I seemed distracted. My wife asked why I was always staring into space. A coworker joked that I looked like I was carrying a secret. Neither of them knew how close they were to the truth. What made things worse was that opportunities kept appearing. Not dramatic opportunities, small ones. A supervisor forgetting a procedure. Someone leaving early. A security issue being postponed because it was considered low priority. Every incident felt like the universe encouraging me. Looking back, I realized I was only seeing what I wanted to see. I remember driving home one evening after a long shift and seriously considering abandoning the whole idea. For nearly an hour, I talked myself out of it. I thought about prison, humiliation, and the people I could hurt. Then I thought about my debts. I thought about the constant pressure. And once again I chose the path that felt easier in the moment. That was the night I stopped treating the theft as a possibility. For the first time, I quietly accepted that I was going to do it. Once I accepted what I was going to do, my anxiety changed shape. Before, I had been afraid of the idea itself. Now I was afraid of time. Every day felt like a countdown. I woke up thinking about the plan and went to sleep replaying possible disasters in my head. The scheduled transfer that I had overheard months earlier was approaching. The closer it got, the more tense the atmosphere became around the office. Managers held meetings behind closed doors. Security checks became more frequent. Everyone seemed focused on protecting what was inside the safe. Ironically, that made me even more nervous. I started imagining that people could somehow read my thoughts. A simple conversation felt like an interrogation. If someone asked how I was doing, I wondered whether they suspected something. Of course, nobody did. The suspicion existed entirely in my own mind. Then the evening arrived when events finally started moving forward. As I left work, I remember glancing back at the building. The sight of it filled me with excitement, and dread in equal measure. For a moment, I almost turned around and walked away from the entire thing. I didn't. The night itself felt strangely ordinary. That's one of the things people rarely talk about. You expect a life-changing moment to arrive with some dramatic signal, a storm, a warning, a sudden burst of clarity. Instead, everything looked completely normal. My heart, however, was anything but normal. I remember feeling every beat in my chest. My hands were unsteady. My thoughts bounced between confidence and panic so quickly that I could barely focus. When the moment finally came to act, reality hit me harder than I expected. Nothing felt smooth. Small complications appeared almost immediately. Delays. Confusion. Uncertainty. The kind of problems that would seem insignificant to an outsider but felt catastrophic to me. At one point I was convinced everything was over. I thought someone had noticed something unusual. I imagined questions, accusations, police officers, headlines. But the crisis passed. The world kept moving. And so did I. What frightened me most wasn't that I was committing the crime. It was how quickly I adapted to it. The line I had feared crossing for months was suddenly behind me, and there was no going back. For months, I had imagined every possible outcome. In my fantasies, I either failed immediately or succeeded perfectly. Reality landed somewhere in between. The first sign of trouble appeared sooner than I expected. People started noticing that things weren't where they were supposed to be. Nothing dramatic at first, just small irregularities that sparked questions. Questions led to conversations, and conversations led to concern. I tried to act normal. That turned out to be harder than planning the crime itself. Every face suddenly looked suspicious to me. Every casual remark sounded loaded with hidden meaning. If two coworkers lowered their voices while talking, I assumed they were discussing me. The worst part was that I couldn't share the pressure with anyone. I carried it alone. Meanwhile, rumors began spreading through the company. Employees speculated about what had happened. Some blamed outsiders. Others blamed management. A few invented elaborate conspiracy theories. Listening to those discussions was surreal. People were searching for answers while I stood a few feet away pretending to be just as confused as everyone else. Inside, I was terrified. The investigation began almost immediately, and the atmosphere inside the company changed overnight. People who had once chatted casually in hallways suddenly became guarded. Managers held emergency meetings. Outside specialists were brought in to review procedures, timelines, and security records. The disappearance became the only thing anyone talked about. I had expected questions. I wasn't prepared for how many there would be. Because of my position, investigators wanted to know where I had been, what work I had performed recently, and whether I had noticed anything unusual. Every interview felt like walking through a minefield. I answered carefully, trying not to sound rehearsed while also avoiding anything that could create new suspicions. The strange thing was that some of my answers were completely truthful. I really had noticed unusual things. I just wasn't telling them the most important one. At night I barely slept. Every unexpected phone call made my stomach tighten. Every knock at my door sent my imagination racing. For the first time since this began, I stopped feeling clever. I started feeling trapped. What nobody tells you about getting away with something is how exhausting it becomes. I used to think the hardest part would be the act itself. Instead, the hardest part was waking up every morning and carrying a secret that could destroy my life if it surfaced. The investigation continued for weeks. Some leads went nowhere. Others seemed dangerous enough to make my pulse spike. More than once, I heard investigators mention details that sounded alarmingly close to the truth. Then they would follow the wrong assumption and disappear down another path. Each time, I felt relief. And each time, the relief was followed by guilt. My wife noticed the change in me before anyone else. She asked why I seemed distant and irritable. I blamed work stress, which wasn't entirely a lie. The pressure was consuming me. The worst moments came when people expressed trust in me. Co-workers defended me when rumors circulated. Managers thanked me for helping during the crisis. Every kind word felt like another weight added to my conscience. I had wanted money. Instead, I found myself living inside a lie. As the months passed, public interest began fading, but my fear didn't. From the outside, it looked like the case was losing momentum. Fewer meetings were held. Fewer questions were asked. Employees slowly returned to their normal routines. Some people even joked about the mystery of the missing safe as if it were an urban legend. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I became paranoid. The problem with a secret is that once you've protected it for long enough, you start seeing threats everywhere. I replayed old conversations in my head, searching for mistakes. I wondered whether I had said too much, acted too nervous, or remembered an important detail incorrectly. Then something happened that genuinely frightened me. An investigator contacted me again. The conversation itself was routine, but hearing from him after so much time had passed reopened every fear I had been trying to bury. For several days afterward, I could barely focus. Nothing came of it. No arrest. No accusation. But the experience taught me something. Even when the danger seems gone, fear has a way of staying behind. A year after everything happened, I realized something strange. The investigation no longer dominated my life. For months, that should have been all I wanted. I had spent countless nights imagining freedom from fear, freedom from suspicion, freedom from the constant feeling that someone was about to uncover the truth. When that freedom finally arrived, it felt empty. The crisis had ended, but the consequences remained. My marriage had suffered from all the secrecy and emotional distance. Relationships with friends felt different too. Not because they knew what I had done, but because I knew. Every conversation carried an invisible barrier that I had created myself. I also discovered that success can become its own punishment. People imagine that getting away with a crime brings satisfaction. Maybe it does for some people. For me, it created a permanent question in the back of my mind. What kind of person was I? I had spent years believing I was fundamentally decent. Now I had proof that under enough pressure, I was capable of something I once considered unthinkable. That realization followed me everywhere. And unlike the investigation, it never really ended. For a long time, I avoided thinking about the crime in concrete terms. It was easier to treat it like a story that had happened to someone else. A bad chapter. A mistake. An isolated event that didn't reflect who I truly was. The older I got, the harder that became. Nobody exposed me. No dramatic confession forced its way into the open. The real confrontation happened in private moments when there was nobody else to blame. I had spent years telling myself that debt pushed me into it. That desperation pushed me into it. That circumstances pushed me into it. Those things influenced my decisions, but they didn't make them. I made them. Accepting that was painful. The truth is that I wasn't a victim of events. I was the author of them. Every rationalization I built eventually collapsed under that simple fact. Oddly enough, admitting responsibility brought a kind of peace. Not forgiveness. Not redemption. Just honesty. For the first time, I stopped arguing with reality. I stopped asking whether I could justify what happened. Instead, I began asking what I was going to do with the person I had become. So that's my story. Years have passed since the safe disappeared, and despite all that time, I still think about it more often than I'd like. Not because of the money, and not because of the mystery that surrounded the case. I think about it because of what it revealed about me. People often imagine that bad decisions arrive suddenly. In my experience, they grow quietly. They begin with small compromises, harmless excuses, and private justifications. By the time the final choice appears, you've already spent months preparing yourself to make it. That's the real danger. If there's anything I've learned, it's that character isn't tested when life is easy. It's tested when you're desperate, angry, embarrassed, or convinced that nobody understands your situation. My warning is simple: don't trust yourself blindly. Question your excuses. Question the stories you tell yourself. The moment you start believing that the rules shouldn't apply to you, you're already heading somewhere dangerous. I was never caught. But getting away with it wasn't a victory. The safe vanished. The consequences didn't. And that's a lesson I've carried for the rest of my life.